Perfect. So again, thanks civictech TO for allowing me to talk tonight. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about recycling. We're going to talk about everything you ever wanted to know about recycling-ish. So tonight we're going to cover off quite a few things. I'm going to try to wrap it up fairly quickly within 15 minutes and leave a lot of time at the end for questions. But what we're going to cover off tonight are a few things. Maybe I have to come over here. Yes, okay. We're going to start by, I'll give you a little background on who I am, what experience I bring to it, and kind of why recycling is important to me. And then we're going to jump into what recycling is and the types of recycling collection that municipalities deal with on a daily, weekly basis. And then we're going to look at something that you've probably heard about, contamination.
I apologize to interrupt. We also have one more policy, which is photograph only with consent. So if you're photographing, let's just ask.
You may photograph away.
Is there anyone who would not want to be photographed tonight? Or videos? All right.
Yeah, and feel free to take pictures of slides and do all that kind of good stuff. So. Yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit about contamination, what it is and why it's bad. And we're gonna look at I think this is really important for cities and civic discussion around the impact of contamination and the impact it has on municipal programs. Then we're gonna, this thing really likes to jump. Okay. And then we're gonna finish up kind of with some tips on how you can recycle right. And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So to kick things off, who am I? Wow, this is, I'm just going to click them. It'll be easier.
I guess it has a closer range.
Yeah. Am I an expert? I don't know, maybe. I don't know if I would consider myself an expert, but I definitely have some domain expertise in the area of recycling. So I graduated in 2009 with an MSc in Environmental Management and Policy from this Hogwarts-looking like place in Sweden called the International Institute for Industrial and Environmental Economics, which rolls right off the tongue. It was great going to school in Sweden, especially in environmental field. For those that don't know, recycling is huge in Sweden. They actually have a 99% recycling rate, which is absolutely crazy to think about. At one point, they had over 100% recycling because they were actually importing materials from other countries, which is very crazy. But I will make one kind of footnote there. They do include in that statistic many times waste to energy. So taking recyclables, burning them into like a power plant and generating heat and energy from it. So you have to look at the statistics a little bit closer, but they do have an extremely high recycling rate when you compare it to other OECD countries. After graduating, I went and I worked for the Ontario Ministry of Climate Change, and I worked there on internal greening programs. So I worked a lot in employee engagement and looked at how the ministry could do better on its internal operations. I was responsible for calculating the carbon footprint there. I was responsible for running a program called Project Green, which basically got employees to think about their day-to-day jobs and how they could approach those in a more environmentally responsible form. I stuck around there for a while, and then Councillor Jam showed up, and he changed the name of Ministry of the Environment to Parks and Rec or something, I don't know what it is now, and that's kind of when I left. And that's when I moved over to technology. I started with a company here in Toronto called Green Gauge Mobile, and that was again in the employee engagement space, really focused on around how can we get enterprise companies to get their employees involved in corporate sustainability programs. That company actually ended up turning into a company that you might have heard of, Nudge Rewards. So they're now the technology is now enabling frontline retail employees. So an interesting pivot there. And then after working at Nudge, I went and I was director of product at a company called Recycle Coach here in town. And basically what we did was we had a suite of products, there was web, mobile, and voice, that really helped cities, municipal governments, county governments, states, provinces communicate more effectively around waste management with their waste and recycling with their citizens, and it was very cool. I got to redesign the whole product top to bottom. You can see up here it is, it's in the top 20 reference apps in Canada right now, and I was down in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and it was actually in the top 50 in the US too, which was very, very cool. So that's a little bit about my background. So we're gonna jump into what is recycling. When we think about recycling, it's really just the action or process of converting waste into reusable material. So when we think about recycling, we want to think about recycling as a feedstock. We take it in and we turn it into other products. It seems like a very simple thing to do, but it gets a little bit more complex once we get humans involved. So to give you an example of how simple recycling is, I have a very short video.
Gosh darn it, gotta do everything yourself around here, picking up humans' trash. Let me show them how it's done here. 1, 2, in the doohickey.
So, in its essence, that's all recycling is. It's making sure that materials are going into the right bin, clean, and in the proper area. So if a bird can do it, we should be able to do it. There's a couple different types of recycling that municipal programs run. The first one is called single stream. And so this is probably what we're familiar with most here in Toronto. This is essentially where we commingle all the recyclables into one bin. We have the big blue bin here in Toronto. In other cities, it might be a green bin. Some have a black bin, some have a brown bin. It's very confusing. There's no kind of standard color that is assigned to recycling across the world. But mostly in Canada, you see blue. And so kind of a couple things to note here is that this is much easier for residents. You have one bin to worry about, you just kind of throw everything in, and it's much cheaper for cities initially. You have fewer trucks, it takes fewer resources to get the recyclables from point A to point B. And then it's easier to add new materials. So obviously the packaging market is not static. There's always new products being added every day. You know, a new energy drink company comes out and they have a cool new product. They throw it in a bottle, and now we need to recycle that. So it's very much easier to add those to a commingled system because it's basically you say you're now allowed to add that to the bin, you basically add it in. On the other side of things is a dual stream system. And this is basically, it's called source separated, and this is where you look at taking out the paper products within it. So you would have a separate bin for paper products. You may have run into this in buildings such as this. So a lot of times in multi-residential buildings, they will do a dual stream system because it'll be a private waste hauler. And the advantage is here that you get much lower levels of contamination. So when you're taking out that paper feedstock and you're separating it out from everything else, you get a much cleaner fraction, and that makes a lot more money for the company collecting it. So that's typically why you see property management companies and multi-residential buildings having a dual stream system. Again, you have higher quality fractions, you get a higher resale value, and there's a lot lower processing costs at the other end for the recycling manufacturer facilities, the MRFs. So what determines if something gets recycled? Well, there's a number of things. Is there a market for the material? You know, if you don't have anywhere to sell that material that you've collected, you're probably not going to collect it. There needs to be some sort of residual value in it. What's the marginal cost of recovery? Does the cost of actually getting that material into the system, is it less than the price that you're going to receive back? And so once the marginal cost of recovery is higher than the price you're going to get back, it doesn't really make sense to collect it from an economic standpoint. One of the interesting things here is to think about, you know, what is the ideal rate of recycling? It's not a question that you hear that much. From an environmental standpoint, you'll see a lot of people say, we should collect 100%. But if you think about the marginal cost of recovering 100% of materials, once you get down to that last 2 or 3 cans, we could have everybody in this room out there trying to find it to recover that last fraction. It's going to cost a lot of money. And it's not going to be economically sustainable. So maybe depending on what city you're in or what location you're in, the optimal recycling rate might be 30%. It might be 40%. It might be, you know, in Sweden, 80%. Another thing that determines whether something gets recycled is the complexity of the material. So what I'm talking about here is a homogeneous material. Think of like an aluminum can that's all pure aluminum, and then you can think about you know, if you go to the gym and you're a weightlifter and you have those packs of berries, those pouches that stand up, those are many different types of plastic, all laminated together, and that's a heterogeneous material, and it's very hard to actually recover the different fractions from that material. The capability of the MRF. So you may have noticed that here in Toronto, we don't collect black plastic. If you travel to other cities, they collect black plastic. And what it really comes down to is this point, the capability of the MRF. So here in Toronto, we have our manufacturing and recycling facilities. They employ what's called an optical sorter as one of their ways of getting materials out. The optical sorter actually looks at the material and will pick out fractions. Black plastics are very hard for the optical sorter to pick out, and it thinks that it's a shadow, and so it doesn't recognize those, and it won't actually separate those out, and that can contaminate further downstream when you're looking at different colors of plastic. Having black plastic commingled with, clear plastic, it becomes less valuable later on. And then at the end, the purity of the fraction, and this is kind of the crux of the thing, is contamination. This is kind of the main thing that determines whether or not something gets recycled. So let's take a little deeper dive into what is contamination. So contamination, very simply put, is things that end up in recycling that shouldn't actually be there in the first place. And they end up in there anyways for a number of reasons. So there's two types of recycling contamination that I'm going to quickly cover. One is material contamination. This is really around, material that's not packaging or paper. Someone throws a tire in the recycling bin that's clearly not recyclable through a municipal system. You might have material that's not recyclable with today's technology. As I was talking about before, those pouches, they're heterogeneous material. They're made up of many different layers. It's very hard to separate out those layers and recover the clean fractions from that, so we don't have the technology. It might simply just be a hazardous material, or a container containing a hazardous material. Think of chemicals, cleaners, those shouldn't be in there. The other type of contamination that municipal systems see are collection contaminations. And this is really around materials that are collected in a way that doesn't allow them to be easily separated out. So we can think about things like tying your recyclables in a plastic bag. I'll show you why that's a huge problem here in 1 second, but keep that in mind. Containers that aren't clean, so when you have your yogurt, Greek yogurt in the morning, and you leave the whole bottom of it in there, and you're like, I'm gonna recycle this, and you throw it in there, that's really bad. That contaminates all the other materials in there, and so thinking back to that we have a commingled system, all that material is going to end up on everything else and basically contaminate all the fractions. And the last thing is materials missorted into the wrong bin. So when we do have dual stream systems where we're separating out paper, if I was to take these pizza boxes and throw them in the paper, they're contaminated with grease, and that's going to ruin that fraction. And the MRF is not going to get the money back from that because it's going to ruin the actual fraction. So let's take a couple minutes just to quickly look at the top sources of material contamination within curbside programs, and you're going to learn a bunch of new terms, which is always fun. The first one is tanglers. I love that term, it's amazing. It's things that really mess up the processing equipment. You can imagine that at a material recycling facility, there's lots of machines, lots of gears turning. So when you throw things in there like ropes or big sheets of plastic or Christmas lights, sheets, you'd be surprised at the things that end up in recycling. That gums up the material, or the machines, and it basically grinds the plant to a halt, literally. Food waste, this is a huge one. Again, not cleaning out your recyclables before throwing them in. Having actual food waste coming in contact with those other fractions contaminates them, so it makes it hard for them to be sold on as raw material. Hazardous waste, this is a number of reasons. You'll see here in a second when I show you what a MRF actually looks like and what happens inside of a MRF. These are people. So these, a lot of what happens in there are people separating out the material by hand. So when we have things like medical sharps or hygiene products in there, it's actually very dangerous for the workers that work there. And then when you have chemicals and paints, again, it's very dangerous. It can contaminate everything. And then once we get into things like smoke detectors and batteries, that is a huge source of fires within these processing facilities. You can imagine if you threw a lithium-ion battery in there and you have, 300 tons of paper and a machine chews up a lithium-ion battery. We all know what happens when lithium hits air. It basically turns into fire. So you can have big fires, and it can bring plants, burn them to the ground. Flexible packaging. So this is an interesting one. You'll probably notice that in the city of Toronto, we actually collect this. Things like overwrap, so on that plastic bottle thing over there, this shrink-wrapped, heat-wrapped plastic, we collect that in Toronto. Pretty much nowhere else that I've ever run into collects that. Pouches, so things like Sunny D, juice boxes, those sorts of things. Heterogeneous plastics, films, those sorts of things that I had mentioned before. Scrap metal, people love to throw scrap metal. I got a carburetor from my motorcycle, I'm just gonna kick that into the old recycling bin, someone's gonna take care of that, that's terrible. It has extremely low resale value. A lot of the time, the scrap metal that ends up in recycling will be things like cast iron or steel, just things that really aren't worth recycling facilities processing that. Lined paper products. This is one that always comes up. Think of things like coffee cups, microwavable food packaging, those really crappy cards that your great aunt got you from the dollar store that has glitter all over them, those sorts of things. Things that can't easily be broken down and turned into a clean fraction. Ceramics and glass. If it's not a bottle or jar, don't throw it in there. Like if you break your favorite mug, don't throw the ceramics in there. Ceramics have a completely different melting point than glass that's used in glass bottles or jars for food. So you can't actually process it. It would be a completely different system. And last is shredded paper and packing peanuts. You can imagine that if you put this all in a bag and a guy or a girl at the recycling facility throws this on there and that thing just goes and explodes, it just causes a mess. So don't throw those in there. So when we think about how, we put stuff in the bin and the truck comes around and it gets taken away and we don't really think about what happens next. Well, it ends up here, and this is a MRF, this is a material recycling facility. And as much as we have optical sorters that do some of the work, 95% of the work is manual. You can imagine what it's like working in here on a 40+ degree day, when people have all their food waste and their honey and stuff, and there's bees everywhere, and there's hygiene products, and it's not the most fun job I could imagine. So when you're making those decisions about what to throw in the recycling bin, think about the people that actually have to separate this stuff out and have a little empathy for them and help make their jobs quite a bit easier. And so this is what happens when tanglers get into the system. So this is a bag breaker. This breaks bags to separate out stuff. But all these things get wrapped in. And on average, recycling facilities in the United States are out at least an hour a day because of these tanglers in the system. And you have to have people basically climb into the machinery and extract them physically themselves and manually. And so I don't know what the latest stat is, but in 2017, there's around 40 deaths at recycling facilities in North America, which is quite a bit if you think about how many people die in the industry that you work in. Almost 50 people dying is quite a lot. So that's the big problem there with tanglers. So what impact does this have on municipal run programs? Well, basically it affects the saleable market. That shrinks. The costs skyrocket to run these programs, and at the end of the day, programs become unsustainable. They just cost too much money, and the effect of that is these sorts of headlines. I'm sure you've all seen these. Millions of Canadians are recycling wrong. It's costing us millions. Ontario government may ditch the Blue Box program after 30% goes to trash. And the big thing that I want to call everybody's attention to, the one thing that's been really transformative in the market in the last 4 years was this center one, China's tough new recycling standards. China implemented a policy called National Sword or Green Sword, and it basically said we're not going to accept foreign materials because essentially what we were doing is we were doing this. We were taking our recycling, and we didn't really care if it was contaminated. We'd throw it in a container, we would put it on one of these guys, and then it would travel across the sea over to China, and now China's like, you know what, we don't want it, because it was their problem. They weren't able to get rid of or separate out the fractions and get that feedstock, again thinking back to recycling as a feedstock. So they basically rejected all foreign imports of recycling into their country. And this ultimately ends up basically at this in the reverse. So people are like, well, I throw it in there, it just all ends up in the trash anyways. it's a little true sometimes. You know, we separate out things, and then if there's no market to sell it, it goes into the trash, and that's what that one news story was alluding to, that 30%, there's been studies that 30% actually ends up in trash. So what can you do to prevent contamination? Here's a couple tips to recycle right, just to keep in mind. Consult your collection guidelines. So municipalities, multi-residential buildings, the place where you work, they all have different companies that handle the recycling, and so there may be different materials. Just educate yourself on the building that you're in and which fractions go where. In this building, cardboard goes into our gray box, we have an organics bin, and then we also have our blue box. And so everybody here is pretty good at separating everything out, and we did a whole education campaign around these are the fractions that you need to separate out. So do that, download an app. There's lots of apps out there. The City of Toronto has their own app. I work for a company, Recycle Coach. If you're in other cities, the nice thing about that app is that it's a network, so it detects what city you're in, and if we have the information, we'll display that back to you. So kind of think of it as like Uber for waste and recycling. You don't have to change anything, you just update, it just updates, and then you have all the recycling regulations there. You can ask Google. So a part of the company that I was at before, we were the first company in the world to create a Google Action and Alexa skill for recycling. So you could actually say in context, you know, when you're in the kitchen and your hands are dirty, you're like, hey Google, ask Recycle Coach, what do I do with this berry container? And it would hit our database, it would resolve it back to a material, consult our database on what should be done with that, and we'd feed back to the user what the local program suggests to do with that material. So you can see that that's a great way to shorten that gap. If someone has to go to a computer and type things in, probably likely not going to do that and make the wrong decision this way. It's contextual, it's the information when they need it. So you can ask Google, and you can actually do it in Toronto. I can't speak 100% for how up to date the database is for Toronto. They weren't a customer, but it was up to date at the time that I left, which was a year ago. So yeah, use at your user beware. Don't wish cycle. This is a huge thing. Particularly millennials. You know, I hate blaming millennials for things, and everybody does this, but in the news they like to say it's a millennial thing, but wish cycling, it makes you feel good. No one wants to throw something out. It feels wasteful, it feels bad, so you're like, yeah, you know what? I'm gonna err on the side of caution. I'm gonna throw this into the recycling bin, and I'm gonna hope that it is recyclable. It feels a lot better. You're not throwing it in the garbage, but most of the time, when in doubt, just throw it out. Don't even think about it, just throw it out. Only put bottles and jars in there. Like I said before, glass, ceramics, don't put in that in there. They have completely different melting temperatures. Clean recyclables only. You don't have to get in there and scrub, but just make sure that there's not tons of food waste hanging out in the bottom of that container. Maybe just run it under the tap for a second, shake it up to get that last pasta sauce out. Don't bag your recyclables. This is a huge one, unless the city specifically tells you. And the last thing, I think people forget this all the time, reduce, reuse, and then recycle. Recycling is kind of a last resort. Stop giving Jeff Bezos money. He's got enough of it. He's won money. Every time you make a purchase, think, do I need this thing? Do I need to go to Amazon and have this delivered in a box with a bunch of air pillows, and it's a USB stick that's, a centimeter by like 2 centimeters, and it's delivered in a refrigerator box? So think about reducing. Reuse it if you can, repurpose it, go on Bun's Trading Zone, find a way to exchange your goods, repurpose them, donate them if you can. And then at the end, if you can't, recycle it, if you can't do the other two. So what we've kind of covered tonight is we learned a little bit about me, we learned what recycling is and the types of recycling collections that municipalities have. We learned what contamination is, why it's bad. We did a little quick dive into the impact contamination has on municipalities, and then we learned how you can recycle right. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Do you have any questions? Okay, we're going to start in the back.
Thanks, Lucas. That was really interesting and a lot of takeaways from there. So I'm really curious about what happens when South Asian countries stop taking the waste from either US, Canada. It goes into landfill, some of it. How can we keep going about that? I mean, there's as much as we can do, at some point there will be a breaking point. What happens then?
Yeah, it was so when National Sword came in, I believe it was late 2017, essentially what happened was that within Southeast Asia, there's a little bit of hopscotching of markets. So China basically said, nah, we're not having it, and then other countries were like, you know what, we'll accept it. And then they quickly realized what China had realized. It's like the volume of waste that was coming in was overwhelming, and there wasn't any kind of economic incentive for them to take it in because the fractions were so unrecoverable. So basically, it was a cascade across Southeast Asia. A lot of countries just saying, no, we're not going to take it. So when you look to the United States, it's impacted the U.S. quite a bit more. So when you look at state governments and you look at regional governments in the U.S., it's a huge problem. There's recycling facilities, MRFs, closing down left, right, and center in the United States just because they don't have the ability to sell on the product. And so sadly, at the end of the day, a lot of these facilities were stockpiling materials in the hope that later on, if the price recovers and they can sell the product on, they would do that. But in a lot of cases, it just ended up in landfill. So you see a lot of places in the United States that basically just stop recycling programs altogether, which is quite sad.
Thank you for your presentation. I am quite interested about how in Italy they are having you recycle bottles and then you can get free bus pass to go places. And I'm curious about how most of the times when we are recycling, it's through a moral perspective about trying to save the planet. But has there been any plans on trying to do more of an incentive model to encourage people to recycle, much like Italy?
For sure, yeah. So the Italy example is actually really interesting. A friend of mine, Francesco, he's one of the founders of a company there, Green Apes, that I believe helped set up that system. But in terms of, how to get people to recycle, right, there's kind of two approaches. Obviously, there's the stick approach, and cities have tried this quite a bit. These are things like, if you find that you're recycling when it's being collected, that you have your collection crews open the top and they actually look in. If they see, contaminants, what they'll do is they'll put what's called an oops sticker on it. And they'll say like, oops, we won't collect it this week, and they'll put it back. Or they will do things like fine you. Then that's been tried. They'll increase, some places have actually looked at property tax and the tax that you pay, and depending on your ratio of like how many times you were caught with that, they'll ding you there. That's a terrible process because basically all it does is like, okay, well, I'm just not going to put it in a recycling bin, I'm going to throw everything in the trash. So I personally believe that when we want to change behaviors, positive incentives work a lot better. So the carrot approach works quite a bit more. If anybody's familiar with BJ Fogg, he's a behavioral economist out of Stanford, and basically the way that he thinks about behaviors and getting people to do behaviors is that there's kind of two axes. There's the difficulty of the behavior, and then there's also the motivation or willingness to do the behavior on the other one. And basically there's a curve that never touches either of the lines, but it just kind of loops like that. It's been a long time since I was in university, and I forget what kind of curve that is. Yeah. I mean, like imagine that. It's like a yeah. And so basically what that is anything that's to the left of the line, people aren't going to do the behavior. So if you have a behavior that's extremely difficult, like becoming an astronaut, like it doesn't matter how much motivation I have to become an astronaut, it's never going to happen unless there's some sort of outside intervention that allows me to become an astronaut. Recycling is actually on the opposite end of that. It is extremely easy behavior to do. We saw a bird literally recycle at the beginning of the presentation, but there's, in a lot of cases, very low motivation to actually do the behavior. So we need to start thinking about ways how we can nudge people towards the desired behavior that we want. At Recycle Coach, we ran a program, we did a pilot program across 14 cities in the United States: Tacoma, Washington, Santa Fe, San Antonio, and essentially what it was an education campaign where we would send out educational messages on a weekly basis with their actual recycling reminders in the app. They would engage with questions, so we would take baseline measurements over time to see that we could measure behavior. And then basically fill out a survey, and you had a chance to win a prize. And the prize was a little stuffed caricature of one of our company's mascots. And in the Tacoma, Washington example, we had 18,000 people participate in the program for, what essentially was a $10 little stuffed animal. So it's very interesting. I think there's a lot of low-cost interventions that you can do on the nudging, more of the carrot side. So yeah, 100% agree with you on that.
So we have a question up here. Can everybody hear okay? Can you, okay, we're gonna have a question and then I'll get to you. Just wanted to make sure everyone could hear the response.
All right, thank you for the presentation. I was curious if you know of any research that has been done on the impacts of recycling, the overall environmental impacts when you consider labor costs and energy costs of recycling versus things like the fancy incinerators they have in Sweden, and the energy capture, and then maybe newer things like thermal polymerization, or any of those things.
Not off the top of my head, but if you give me your name, I have lots of contacts in Sweden that I'm sure to pull out examples of life cycle assessments that look at the different ways of tackling materials and material recovery, and how we get either energy